Jang Hyun's eyes never left the monitor. In the windowless silence of his private command center, the only sound was the low hum of the servers and the frantic thudding of his own heart. The digital clock in the corner of the screen flickered, 2:14 a.m. He leaned in, the blue light of the high-definition display carving sharp shadows into his face. There she was. Asha Virelle. The woman his lieutenants called a lethal ghost, the American caregiver he had been told was a plant by the Dragon Head Syndicate. On the screen, she was moving through the darkened West Wing with a silent, haunting grace. In the infrared light, her simple cream cardigan looked ghostly, her natural hair pulled back in a tight, practical bun. To anyone else, she looked like a nurse. To Hyun, she looked like a threat he had let into his inner sanctum. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of steel and secrets, but his sister's warnings and the leaked intelligence reports all pointed to the same terrifying truth: Asha was here to dismantle him from the inside. She reached his mother's heavy oak door and paused. Hyun's hand hovered over the silent alarm. With one tap, his elite security team would storm the hallway. Asha would be neutralized, taken to a black site, and interrogated until there was nothing left of her. He wanted to press it. He should have pressed it. But then, she pushed the door open, and the camera inside the bedroom activated. Mrs. Jang was awake, huddled in the corner of her bed, her eyes wide with the hollow, terrifying vacancy of Alzheimer's. She was trembling, her hands clawing at the pale pink blanket as she whispered a name from a past that no longer existed. Asha stepped into the frame. What she did in the next 60 seconds would change the course of Jang Hyun's life forever. Before we go any further, I want you to think about something. Have you ever looked at someone and seen exactly what you were trained to see, a liar, an enemy, a stranger, only to realize you were the one who was blind? Have you ever had your heart guarded by a suit of armor, only for one person to find the single crack you didn't know existed? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready to see how a man who rules a city with an iron fist was brought to his knees by a woman who had nothing but a warm smile and a prayer, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. This story is about to prove that the most dangerous person in a mafia boss's life isn't the one with the gun, it's the one with the heart. Now, let's go back to the beginning. 7 weeks before that midnight surveillance, Asha Virelle stood in the center of the bustling Incheon terminal, clutching a single worn suitcase. She didn't know about the Dragon Head Syndicate, and she didn't know about the blood on Jang Hyun's hands. All she knew was that back in the States, her own family was one hospital bill away from the street. The offer she had received was almost too good to be true. A staggering $20,000 a month to live in a secluded mansion and care for a woman who lived in a fog. It was supposed to be a simple job. A way out. She had no idea she was stepping into a war zone, or that she was the only one who could end it. Asha Virelle stepped out of the sleek black sedan, and the humidity of Seoul hit her like a physical weight, though it was nothing compared to the heavy silence of the Jang estate. Towering wrought iron gates hissed shut behind her, sealing out the world and leaving her standing before a fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone. It wasn't just a house, it was a monument to power, cold and unyielding. Arrayed across the wide limestone driveway were men who looked less like security and more like statues carved from obsidian. They wore identical, razor-sharp black suits, their faces devoid of expression, their eyes shielded by dark glasses even under the overcast sky. They didn't greet her. They didn't offer a smile. They simply tracked her movements with a synchronized, predatory stillness that made Asha's skin prickle. Asha smoothed the fabric of her cream cardigan, her fingers momentarily brushing the small wooden cross she wore beneath her shirt. She looked like a drop of milk in a sea of ink. In her simple white top and modest bun, she was the only soft thing in an environment designed to intimidate. Despite the tremors of nerves in her stomach, she squared her shoulders and offered a polite, weary nod to the guard closest to her. "I'm Asha Virelle," she said, her voice clear despite the jet lag. "I believe I'm expected." The guard didn't blink. He reached for a translucent earpiece, murmured a few sharp syllables in Korean, and then stepped aside with clinical precision, gesturing toward the towering front doors. As she crossed the threshold, the interior proved even colder than the exterior. The floors were polished black marble, reflecting the dim glow of recessed lighting like a dark lake. There were no family photos on the walls, no stray shoes by the door, no scent of cooking, only the sterile, sharp smell of expensive floor wax and filtered air. Miss Virelle. The voice was like a low-frequency hum, vibrating through the floorboards before she even saw the speaker. Jang Hyun stood at the top of the grand staircase, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the minimalist architecture. He was younger than she expected, his features carved with a lethal symmetry, his eyes two dark voids that seemed to catalog her every flaw in a single glance. He didn't move toward her, he simply watched, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored trousers. Asha forced herself to meet his gaze. She had spent years in the most difficult wards of Atlanta's public hospitals, dealing with families at their breaking point and patients lost to the shadows of their own minds. She knew how to hold her ground, but Jang Hyun wasn't a grieving relative, he was a king in a world of shadows. "Mr. Jang," she said, inclining her head. "Thank you for the opportunity. I've reviewed your mother's files, and I'd like to see her as soon as possible." Transitioning to a new face can be difficult for someone in her condition. Hyun descended the stairs, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped exactly 3 feet away, encroaching on her personal space just enough to be an assertion of dominance. "My mother is not a case, Miss Virelle. She is the only thing in this house that matters. If you upset her, if you fail her, you won't just be fired. You will be erased." The threat was delivered with a terrifying lack of emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. Asha felt a flash of heat, not of fear, but of the protective instinct that had defined her career. "With all due respect, sir," Asha replied, her voice dropping into a soothing yet firm register, "if you wanted someone who was afraid of you, you should have hired another guard. You hired me because I know how to find the person behind the illness. Your mother doesn't need a fortress right now. She needs a hand to hold." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or a brief flash of irritation, crossed Hyun's face before his expression reset into a mask of stone. He looked at her small, calloused hands, then back to her eyes. The contrast was jarring, his world of iron against her world of empathy. "We shall see," he murmured, turning on his heel. "Follow me. And remember, in this house, the walls don't just have ears. They have eyes." As he led her deeper into the labyrinth of the mansion, Asha glanced at the corners of the ceiling, noticing the tiny, blinking red lights of the security cameras. She felt the weight of his suspicion like a physical burden, but as they approached the room where an elderly woman sat alone in the dark, Asha let out a slow breath. The fortress was cold, but she had brought her own light. The door to Jang Hyun's private study didn't just close. It sealed with a pressurized hiss that suggested the room was a vacuum, devoid of oxygen or mercy. Asha stood in the center of the plush Persian rug, the warmth of her cream cardigan feeling increasingly inadequate against the literal and metaphorical chill of the space. Hyun didn't sit behind his massive ebony desk. Instead, he paced the floor behind it like a panther in a cage made of mahogany and gold, his movements precise and unsettlingly silent. "You have seen the house, Miss Virelle," he began, his voice dropping to a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Now you will understand the price of staying in it." He tossed a thick leather binder onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "This is your life for the foreseeable future. It is a contract of silence, total and absolute. You are not a guest. You are not a friend. You are a ghost inhabiting a fortress." Asha stepped forward, her eyes scanning the top page. It wasn't just a standard non-disclosure agreement, it was a map of her own imprisonment. There were clauses regarding the tracking of her personal devices, the prohibition of outside contact without oversight, and a list of restricted zones that covered nearly 60% of the estate. "Rule 1, Hyun said, stopping his pace to fix her with a stare that felt like ice water hitting her skin. Asha noticed it then. The deadness she had sensed earlier wasn't just exhaustion. It was a complete absence of light, as if the man standing before her had long ago cauterized his own soul to survive the world he ruled. You do not speak of what you see or hear within these walls. Not to your family in Atlanta, not to the staff, not to the sky. If a word leaves this house, you will find that my reach is much longer than the flight back to Georgia. Asha swallowed, but she didn't look away. I'm here to care for a woman who is suffering, Mr. Jang. I have no interest in your business. You will have no interest in anything, he countered sharply. Rule 2, you do not question the security. If a door is locked, it is for a reason. If a guard tells you to move, you move. And Rule 3, the most important one, you do not attempt to fix anything in this house other than my mother's comfort. Do not look for humanity where it has been discarded. You are here to provide a service, not to be a conscience. As he spoke, a young maid entered the room with a tray of tea, her head bowed so low her chin nearly touched her chest. Asha watched the girl's hands, they were trembling so violently that the porcelain rattled against the tray. The girl didn't steal a single glance at Hyun, she moved with a frantic, desperate haste, as if being noticed by the master of the house was a fate worse than death. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, it wasn't just respect or professional distance, it was a thick, suffocating layer of terror that seemed to coat every surface of the mansion. Hyun ignored the girl entirely, treated her as if she were a piece of furniture, his gaze remaining locked on Asha. Do you understand the terms? Asha looked from the trembling maid to the man with the hollow eyes. She saw the immense wealth surrounding him. The rare artifacts, the bespoke suit, the sheer power, and realized it was all a gilded cage. He was protecting his mother, yes, but he was doing it by turning his home into a tomb. I understand the rules, Mr. Jang, Asha said, her voice softening with a pity that she knew would infuriate him if he recognized it. But silence and fear are two different things. Your mother is living in a world of confusion. If she senses the fear in this house, she will never feel safe. I'll sign your papers, but I won't adopt your coldness. She needs a pulse, not just a paycheck. Hyun stepped around the desk, leaning in until he was inches from her face. Asha could smell the expensive sandalwood and the faint metallic scent of something sharp. He searched her face, looking for the crack, the moment she would flinch under the weight of his dead stare. Sign the contract, Miss Virelle, he whispered, his breath cold against her cheek. And pray you never give me a reason to remind you why everyone else in this house is afraid to breathe. Asha picked up the pen and signed her name in a steady, elegant script. She was an outsider in a fortress of monsters, but as she handed the binder back, she made a silent vow, she would save the mother, and if there was anything left of the son, she would find that, too. The heavy, silk curtains in Mrs. Jang's suite were drawn tight, but they couldn't muffle the sounds of the woman's distress. It was one of the bad mornings, where the fog in her mind turned into a violent storm. Mrs. Jang was hunched over her vanity, her frail hands trembling as she swiped at her own reflection, her breath coming in jagged, terrified gasps. The silver-gray strands of her hair were a tangled nest, a physical manifestation of the chaos inside her head. In the corner, a young nurse stood frozen, clutching a bottle of sedative as if it were a shield, terrified to approach the woman who was currently screaming in a language that sounded like heartbreak. Asha entered the room with a quiet, grounded presence that seemed to lower the temperature of the air. She didn't rush toward the elderly woman. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, a safe distance away, and began to hum. A low, rhythmic melody from the Georgia coast that carried the salt of the Atlantic in its notes. It's okay, Mama Jang, Asha murmured, her voice a warm honey that cut through the sharp edges of the room's panic. The sun is up. The world is still here. From the shadows of the doorway, hidden by the curve of the hall, Jang Hyun watched. He had come to authorize the sedation, his face set in its usual mask of detached efficiency. He expected to see a struggle. He expected to hear the clinical coldness of a professional. Instead, he saw Asha reach into her bag and pull out a wide-toothed wooden comb and a small jar of shea butter, the scent of nut and earth beginning to drift through the sterile room. With slow, deliberate movements, Asha moved to the vanity. She didn't grab the woman's hands, she simply placed her own palms flat on the wood next to them. Mrs. Jang quietened, her watery eyes darting to Asha's smooth, dark face. "My grandmother used to say that all our worries get caught in the knots of our hair," Asha whispered. "If we brush the knots out, the worries have nowhere to hide." Asha took a small amount of the cream, warming it between her palms before gently pressing them to the crown of Mrs. Jang's head. The tactile sensation, the warmth, the slide of the oil, the firm but tender pressure, seemed to ground the elderly woman instantly. Hyun leaned closer, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He had spent millions on specialists who spoke of neural pathways and chemical imbalances, yet here was this outsider using nothing but a wooden tool and a story. Asha began to work. She used a traditional technique she had learned as a girl, sectioning the silver hair with practiced ease. She started from the very tips, working her way up to the roots so as not to tug or cause pain. It was a rhythmic, meditative process. A language of touch that transcended the barriers of Seoul and Atlanta, of Korean and English. As the comb glided through the silver strands, Mrs. Jang's shoulders, which had been hiked up to her ears in tension, finally dropped. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her. Her eyes, once frantic, began to drift shut. She leaned back into Asha's touch, her head resting against the younger woman's stomach as the rhythmic, scritch slide of the comb became the only sound in the room. "There now," Asha said softly, her fingers deft and sure. "The knots are going. The peace is coming." Hyun felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. He had seen his mother sedated into a stupor, and he had seen her restrained in silk ties, but he had never seen her look peaceful. He watched the contrast of Asha's deep, rich skin against his mother's pale, translucent brow. It was a stunning visual of two worlds colliding, yet in this moment, they were perfectly synchronized. He found himself curious about the oil, the comb, and the woman who looked at his mother not as a case or a burden, but as a sacred responsibility. For the first time, the deadness in Hyun's eyes flickered with a spark of something else, an unwanted, terrifying curiosity. He stepped back into the shadows as Asha began to braid the hair into a soft, protective style, her eyes closed in a prayerful focus. Hyun realized then that Asha wasn't just caring for his mother's body. She was tending to a soul that he had long ago assumed was lost. He turned away, his mind already racing with a new kind of suspicion, one born not of hate, but of the fear that he was starting to feel something he couldn't control. The fragile peace Asha had cultivated in the nursery was shattered not by a sound, but by the entry of a man who carried the stench of old gunpowder and fresh resentment. Min-ho, Hyun's trusted second-in-command, stood in the doorway of the command center, his face a mask of loyal concern that didn't quite reach his narrow, calculating eyes. He had served the Jang family for a decade, rising through the ranks with a blade that never hesitated, yet he found himself sidelined by a woman who fought with nothing more than patience and a wooden comb. "She's a professional, boss." "Just not the kind you think," Min-ho said, tossing a grainy, intercepted transcript onto the desk in front of Hyun. Hyun didn't look up from the monitors. On the screen, Asha was reading a book of poetry to Mrs. Jang, her voice a low murmur that seemed to suit the very air in the room. "She's a caregiver, Min-ho." Her background check was spotless. "Check it again," Min-ho spat, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "The Dragon Head Syndicate doesn't use assassins for everything. They use honey traps. They find someone who looks like a saint, someone you'd never suspect, and they plant them in the heart of the home. Why else would a woman from Atlanta fly halfway across the world for a nursing job? It's too clean. It's a setup." Hyun finally turned, his gaze as sharp as a razor. "You're reaching, Min-ho. She's been here weeks and hasn't asked a single question about the business." "That's because she doesn't have to," Min-ho countered, leaning over the desk. "She's already in. She has the ear of the woman who knows every secret your father ever whispered. And last night, I caught her on the balcony making a call. Encrypted. To a burner phone in the Red District. It was a lie, polished and perfect. Min-ho had spent the afternoon planting a sophisticated listening device, a bug no larger than a grain of rice, behind the headboard of Asha's bed. He had already prepared a looped audio file of static encoded phrases to feed into the system, enough to sow the seeds of a betrayal that would force Hyun to eliminate her. Hyun's jaw tightened. The deadness in his eyes, which had begun to thaw under the influence of Asha's kindness, suddenly refroze. Paranoia was the foundation of his empire. He couldn't afford to be wrong, even if being right meant losing the only light his mother had found in years. If she's a plant, Hyun said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level, I want to see her break. I want to see the moment the mask slips. Then watch her tonight, Minho suggested, a thin, oily smile touching his lips. I've patched the audio from her room directly into your private line. Listen to how she speaks when she thinks she's alone. You'll hear that saint turn into a snake. As Minho exited the room, he felt the weight of the bug's receiver in his pocket. He wasn't just protecting the syndicate, he was protecting his own position. Asha Virelle was an anomaly, a variable he couldn't control. In his world, things that couldn't be controlled had to be destroyed. Later that evening, after the house had fallen into its uneasy, guarded slumber, Hyun sat in the dark of his study. He clicked the toggle on his console. The audio from Asha's room hissed to life. He expected to hear codes. He expected to hear the cold, clinical voice of a spy reporting back to her handlers. Instead, he heard the soft, muffled sound of sobbing. It wasn't the tactical weeping of a performer, it was the raw, exhausted sound of a woman who had spent the day pouring her strength into a dying woman and had nothing left for herself. I'm trying, Daddy, he heard her whisper, her voice cracking. I'm trying to bring the money home. Just hold on a little longer. Please. Hyun froze, his finger hovering over the record button. The contrast between Minho's warnings and the heartbreaking reality of the woman on the other side of the wall created a violent friction in his mind. He looked at the shadows on the wall, feeling the weight of the cameras and the microphones he had permitted. He was the hunter, the predator his father had raised him to be. But as he listened to Asha's quiet prayer for her own father's life, Jang Hyun felt a sickening realization. The bug in the room wasn't just recording a spy. It was recording the destruction of his own remaining humanity. The shadows in the command center seemed to deepen as Jang Hyun committed himself to the watch. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, surrounded by 16 glowing rectangles of light that stripped away every layer of Asha Virelle's privacy. Following Minho's warning, Hyun had ordered a total blackout of the wing's standard operations, authorizing a 72-hour window of absolute, unblinking surveillance. He told himself it was tactical, that a man in his position couldn't afford a heart, but as the hours bled into days, the proof he sought refused to manifest. Instead of the calculated movements of a spy, the cameras captured the grueling reality of a woman being slowly hollowed out by her own devotion. On the second night, at 2:15 a.m., Hyun watched as Asha finally retreated to her small staff room. She didn't reach for a burner phone or check a hidden compartment for documents. She didn't even turn on the overhead light. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her frame trembling with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Through the high-definition lens, Hyun saw her reach into the pocket of her cardigan and pull out a crumpled, tear-stained photograph. He adjusted the zoom, his breath hitching as the image came into sharp focus on the central monitor. It wasn't a contact or a map of his estate. It was an older black man, his face gaunt and framed by hospital tubes, holding Asha's hand in a grip that looked like a final goodbye. Asha didn't make a sound at first. She simply traced the man's face with her thumb, her head bowed until her forehead touched the paper. Then, the first sob broke through the silence of the room, picked up with haunting clarity by the pinhole microphone Minho had hidden in the headboard. I'm so close, Daddy, she whispered, her voice a ragged thread of hope. Just 3 more months. I've saved enough for the first surgery. I just need to stay here. I just need to keep them happy. Hyun felt a cold, physical ache settle in his chest. He looked at the obscene salary he paid her. The $20,000 a month he had assumed was the price of her greed, and realized it was actually the price of a life. Every time she endured his cold stares, every time she ignored his sister's veiled threats, and every hour she spent soothing his mother's terrors, she was buying her father another day of breath. He watched her pull a small ledger from her nightstand, meticulously subtracting her modest living expenses from her earnings, her hands shaking as she calculated the remaining balance. There was no honey trap here. There was no syndicate plot. There was only a daughter's desperation, a mirror image of the very drive that kept Hyun tethered to his own mother's fading life. On the third day, the surveillance revealed the most damning evidence of all. Asha found a misplaced envelope of cash in the laundry room, money Minho had likely planted as a test. Without a second's hesitation, she walked straight to the house manager and handed it over, her expression one of simple, weary honesty. She didn't even look at the amount. She just went back to Mrs. Jang's room to sing the low, southern lullabies that were the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Hyun leaned back, the blue light of the monitors making him look like a ghost in his own house. He had been looking for a monster to fight, a tangible enemy he could crush with his influence and his guards. But as he watched Asha fold the photograph back into her pocket and stand up to begin her third double shift in a row, he realized he had found something far more dangerous to a man of his kind. He had found a person of pure, unadulterated goodness. The 72 hours weren't up, but Hyun didn't need to see any more. He reached for the console and began to delete the files, one by one, erasing the evidence of his own paranoia. He had spent his life believing that everyone had a price, but as he watched Asha Virelle walk down the hallway toward his mother's room, he realized she wasn't for sale. She was simply there to love, and in his world of shadows, that was the most revolutionary act he had ever witnessed. The sound of shattering jade was sharper than a gunshot in the silent afternoon air. It happened in the blink of an eye. Mrs. Jang, startled by a sudden shadow against the window, had lashed out at the vanity, sending a centuries-old pendant to the marble floor. The heirloom, a deep emerald stone that had belonged to the Jang family for 4 generations, lay in a dozen jagged pieces. Mrs. Jang froze, the realization of what she'd done piercing through the fog of her dementia for one agonizing second. Her face crumpled, a low, keening wail rising from her throat as she stared at the wreckage of the only physical memory she had left of her own mother. Asha was on her knees in an instant, not to gather the stones, but to gather the woman. She wrapped her arms around Mrs. Jang's trembling frame, shielding her eyes from the debris. "It's okay, Mama Jang. It's just a thing. It's just stone," Asha whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the history of that pendant. She knew it was the soul of the Jang lineage. The heavy doors swung open with a violence that made the air in the room vibrate. Jang Hyun stood there, flanked by Minho and a phalanx of guards. His gaze dropped immediately to the floor, the sight of the shattered jade draining the last bit of color from his face. "Who did this?" Hyun's voice was a low, vibrating growl. It wasn't the voice of a son, it was the voice of a man who had just seen his heritage desecrated. "Mrs. Jang began to shake, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She looked up at her son, her eyes swimming with a terror that broke Asha's heart. In this house of iron rules, there was no room for accidents, especially not from those who were supposed to be fading. If Hyun saw his mother as the cause of the destruction, it would only reinforce his belief that she was becoming a burden, a broken thing to be managed rather than a woman to be loved. Asha felt the weight of the surveillance she knew was watching. She felt the predatory heat of Minho's gaze, waiting for her to stumble. Slowly, deliberately, Asha stood up, stepping between Hyun and his mother. She tucked a shard of the jade into her own palm, the sharp edge drawing a thin line of red across her skin. "It was me, Mr. Jang," Asha said, her voice steady and devoid of a tremor. Hyun's eyes snapped to hers, the deadness returning with a vengeful intensity. "You?" "I was cleaning the vanity. I was careless," Asha lied, her gaze never wavering. "I bumped the display case. It's my fault." Behind her, Mrs. Jang let out a soft, confused whimper, but Asha reached back and squeezed the elderly woman's hand, a silent command to stay quiet. Minho stepped forward, a cruel light in his eyes. "A caregiver's hands are supposed to be her life, boss. Breaking a family soul, in the old days, we'd take the hands that did it. Hyun walked toward Asha, his presence so suffocating it felt like the room was losing oxygen. He stopped inches from her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He looked at the blood trickling from her palm, then at the shattered stone. He knew the truth. He had seen his mother's frantic movements on the feed just seconds before he reached the door. He knew Asha was shielding her. He reached out, his gloved hand gripping Asha's chin, forcing her to look up at him. The silence was deafening. The guards held their breath, expecting a dismissal or worse. You realize what this stone was, Hyun whispered, his thumb brushing near her jawline. I realize what she is, Asha replied, her voice a soft, defiant anchor. The stone can be replaced, sir. Her dignity cannot. Hyun saw the steel in her. He saw a woman willing to take the wrath of a syndicate leader just to spare an old woman a moment of shame. The anger he was supposed to feel, the fury that was expected of him, was being strangled by a burgeoning, terrifying respect. Leave us, Hyun commanded, not taking his eyes off Asha. But boss, Minho started. Out! Hyun roared, the sound echoing off the marble. As the room cleared, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, if only for a fraction of a second. He let go of Asha's chin, his hand lingering near her neck for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He looked at his mother, who was now quietly humming, tucked away in the safety of the world Asha had built for her. Clean it up, Hyun said, his voice strangely hollow. And fix your hand. I don't want my mother smelling blood. He turned and walked out, but as he reached the hallway, he didn't head for his study. He stood in the shadows, his hands trembling. He had set out to catch a thief, but instead, he had found a guardian. And for the first time in his life, Jang Hyun felt truly, utterly powerless. The sky over Seoul broke open that night, a torrential downpour that turned the world outside the fortress into a blurred landscape of gray and neon. Inside, the mansion was silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the reinforced glass. Jang Hyun sat in the security wing, his eyes fixed on the monitors, watching Asha sit by his mother's bedside. The tension from the shattered jade still hung in the air like a low-pressure system, but there was a newfound stillness in the way he observed her. Then, the world went black. It wasn't a flicker or a brownout. The power was severed with a surgical precision that set off the silent alarms in Hyun's mind before the backup generators could even hum to life. But the generators didn't kick in. Boss, they've cut the main lines and bypassed the internal backup, Minho's voice crackled over the radio, tight with an uncharacteristic edge of panic. It's the Dragon Head. They're already inside the perimeter. Hyun stood up, drawing his weapon in a fluid motion, but the magnetic locks on the security wing had engaged in the fail-secure position. He was trapped behind 3 inches of reinforced steel. He lunged for the manual override, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. On the tablet in his hand, powered by its own independent battery, the night vision feeds flickered back to life. He watched the hallway outside his mother's suite. Shadows moved, men in tactical gear, the light from their suppressed weapons cutting through the gloom like predatory eyes. Asha, Hyun whispered, his voice a ragged plea against the screen. Get out of there. Through the green-tinted lens of the camera, he saw Asha bolt upright. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She looked at the door, then at the terrified woman beside her who was beginning to wail as the darkness closed in. Asha reached out, her hands finding Mrs. Jang's in the dark, her touch a grounding wire in the chaos. Hyun watched, paralyzed by the glass between them, as Asha hauled Mrs. Jang out of bed. She didn't head for the main door, she knew the guards were compromised. Instead, she guided the elderly woman toward the heavy walk-in closet, a space Hyun had reinforced as a temporary panic room years ago. The bedroom door splintered open. 3 men stepped in, their movements cold and mechanical. They scanned the bed with infrared sights, finding it empty. Hyun held his breath, his forehead pressed against the cold steel of the security door. On the screen, he saw Asha and his mother crouched behind a false panel in the back of the closet. Mrs. Jang was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at her throat. Asha did something Hyun would never forget. She pulled the older woman into her lap, wrapping her entire body around her, and pressed her palm firmly over his mother's mouth, not to silence her, but to share her own steady, rhythmic breathing. Asha closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer, her forehead resting against Mrs. Jang's silver hair. She was a shield of flesh and bone against a tide of lead and hate. One of the gunmen approached the closet. He gripped the handle, his gloved hand tensing. Hyun felt a roar of primal fury build in his chest, a desperate, helpless heat. He threw his shoulder against the door, the impact shuddering through his bones. "Don't touch them," he growled into the empty room. Just as the gunman began to pull the closet door open, a flashbang detonated in the hallway. Minho and the loyalist guards had finally broken through. The bedroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of muffled gunfire and shattering glass. In the strobe light flashes of the skirmish, Hyun saw Asha never once let go. She stayed wrapped around his mother, a dark angel of mercy in the center of a killing field. When the room finally went still, and the emergency lights flickered into a dim, ghostly red, the closet door was pulled open by a blood-spattered Minho. Asha looked up, her eyes wide and shining with tears, but her hands remained steady. She didn't look for a hero. She looked down at the woman in her arms. "She's safe," Asha rasped, her voice breaking. "She's safe, Mr. Jang." Hyun, watching from the monitor as the electronic locks finally hissed open, dropped his head into his hands. He had spent his life thinking he was the one who provided protection. He realized now that he had merely provided walls. It was the woman from Atlanta, with her prayers and her calloused hands, who had provided the only sanctuary that mattered. The smell of ozone and spent gunpowder still hung heavy in the air as the emergency lights transitioned from a panicked red to a steady, clinical white. The mansion felt hollowed out, its invincibility shattered by the night's violence. In the center of the master suite, Asha sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still stained with the dust of the panic room, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Jang, who had finally drifted into a fitful, medicated sleep. Jang Hyun stood by the window, his back to her. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers, but something far more jagged. Without a word, he turned and gestured for her to follow him. He led her not to the kitchen for tea or to the foyer to see her out, but to the one room she was never meant to see, the security wing. As the heavy steel door hissed open, Asha stopped short. The wall of monitors greeted her like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Her breath hitched as she saw herself on the screens. Dozens of angles of her private moments. She saw herself brushing Mrs. Jang's hair, saw herself crying over her father's photo, saw herself sleeping in the hallway. "You watched me," she whispered, the words sounding small in the high-tech room. "Every minute. Every prayer. Every tear." Hyun didn't look at her. He couldn't. "I was told you were a spy. I was told you were a honey trap sent to dismantle my family. In my world, trust is a fairy tale told to victims before they disappear." Asha stepped closer to the monitors, her fingers trembling as she touched the screen showing her small bedroom. The violation felt physical, a cold intrusion that reached deeper than any weapon. "I came here to help your mother. I stayed here through the threats and the coldness because I thought, beneath all this armor, you actually cared about her. But you didn't even trust me to love her." "I do now," Hyun said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I saw everything, Asha. I saw the jade. I saw you shield her tonight when the bullets were flying. I saw the person I thought didn't exist." He turned to face her, his hands open and empty, a rare gesture of total surrender. "I expect you to leave. My driver is waiting. I've doubled your final payment, and I've secured a private medical transport for your father back in Atlanta. You've done more than enough. You shouldn't be here when the next wave comes." Asha looked at the screens one last time, then at the man who had spent his life behind glass. The heartbreak in her eyes was profound, a shattering of the respect she had quietly begun to build for him. She felt the weight of the betrayal, the sting of being a specimen under a microscope. You're right, she said softly. You are exactly the monster they say you are. Not because of the violence, but because you think everyone is as hollow as you. She turned toward the door, and for a heartbeat, Hyun's world truly ended. But then, she stopped. She looked down the long, shadowed hallway toward the room where his mother lay sleeping, the woman who called out for a husband who was gone and a son who was too frozen to touch her. Asha turned back, her jaw set with a fierce, quiet resolve. I should go. I should take that money and never look back at this tomb. But if I leave, she wakes up alone. If I leave, the only person who knows how to brush the knots out of her soul is gone. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his suit jacket, radiating a heat that made him flinch. I'm staying. Not for you. Not for the money. I'm staying for her. But don't you ever think for a second that I've forgiven you for watching me weep for my father and doing nothing but taking notes. She walked out, leaving Hyun alone in the glow of his monitors. He watched her on the screen as she returned to his mother's side and took the elderly woman's hand. He had his proof, he had his security. But as he watched Asha settle back into her vigil, Jang Hyun realized that while he owned the cameras, he was the only one truly trapped in the dark. The aftermath of the Dragon Head attack left the mansion in a state of hypervigilance that felt more like a siege than a recovery. Guards stood at every interval of the hallway, their hands never straying far from their holsters. In the center of this tension, Asha moved like a ghost, her face pale but her resolve unbroken. She had just finished settling Mrs. Jang into a heavy, deep sleep when a shadow fell across the doorway. Jang Hyun didn't enter. He stood in the threshold, the harsh overhead lights of the hallway casting his shadow long and thin across the carpet. He looked older than he had 48 hours ago, the weight of his empire finally showing in the weary set of his shoulders. The intelligence reports came in an hour ago, Hyun said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The hit on this house wasn't just about me. They saw how you moved her. They saw you find the panic room. To my enemies, you are no longer just a caregiver. You are leverage. You are the only person who can get close enough to the Jang matriarch to hurt me. Asha stood up, her hands smoothing the front of her cream cardigan, a habit she'd developed to keep her fingers from shaking. I'm an American citizen, Mr. Jang. I have a passport. I can go home. They would pick you up before you reached the tarmac, Hyun countered, his eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate intensity. And even if you made it to Atlanta, they would follow. You've seen their faces. You've cost them a victory. In their world, that's a debt paid in blood. He finally stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt strangely intimate. He walked to the window, looking out at the city he ruled, a city that was currently hunting the woman behind him. I cannot protect you as an employee, he said, his back still turned. As an employee, you are a liability I can be forced to discard. But as a Jang, you would be untouchable. There is a weight to my name that even the Dragon Head fears to cross. It carries legal protections, diplomatic immunity, and a vow of total war if a single hair on your head is touched. Asha felt the air leave her lungs. What are you saying? Hyun turned around. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, heavy gold band, not a diamond, but a seal. I am proposing a marriage of sanctuary. A legal union. It would be a contract, much like the one you signed when you arrived. Business only. You would have your own quarters, your own life, and the funds to ensure your father never wants for a single thing again. In exchange, you stay. You keep my mother in the light, and I keep the world from swallowing you whole. Asha stared at the ring, then at the man offering it. He was presenting it as a tactical maneuver, a cold extension of his security protocol. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw that deadness had been replaced by something raw and terrifyingly vulnerable. His words spoke of contracts and leverage, but his gaze was pleading. He wasn't just trying to save her, he was trying to keep the only source of warmth he had ever known from walking out of his life. You spied on me, Asha reminded him, her voice a whisper. You broke the only thing we had. I know, Hyun said, stepping closer until the scent of his sandalwood cologne mixed with the medicinal smell of the room. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to cry alone in the dark again. Not as your boss. As your husband. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of two different worlds colliding. Asha looked at the sleeping woman in the bed, the mother who had become her own. And then at the man who was offering her a cage made of gold and safety. She saw the danger, the mafia ties, and the blood on his hands. But she also saw the broken boy behind the monster, the one who was finally learning that some things are worth more than power. Slowly, Asha reached out. She didn't take the ring, but she touched his hand, her warmth seeping into his cold skin. 24 hours, she said, her voice steady. I need to talk to my father. And I need you to promise that you will stop watching me through a screen and start looking at me with your own eyes. Hyun's fingers closed around hers, a grip that was firm, protective, and for the first time, honest. I haven't been able to look at anything else, he confessed. In the quiet of the nursery, the mafia boss and the caregiver stood in the center of a brewing war, bound by a contract that was supposed to be about business, but was already starting to feel like a revolution of the heart.